Afternoon. Had a nice family feast day. I'm here outside on the terrace of the house I grew up in. So it's a good day to record a meditation outside. Perfect day. I started 2 months ago upstairs in the room that I grew up in on February the 13th. The first of the meditations that are going to go for a full calendar year, full 12 months rather, because they're February to February, commemorating the writing that I originally did 10 years ago. And it's a good day to start the next set of meditations. And this chapter, which is chapter 5, is the dwelling of Heraclitus in the book Being and Learning. That was the ultimate sort of end result of this writing, but didn't start off that way. So the meditation I'm going to read is like the one that was the meditation that transitioned from the one on the chapter 3 on Lao Tzu into chapter 4 on the allegory of the cave. If you go back and check that one out, it is the transition happened with passage and the saying of the sage, and passageway and into the allegory, and then this one then is a transition from the allegory, and ultimately it's going to take up Heraclitus. So let's begin. The disorienting transition. Oh, and I wanted to say that this is a good day to make that transition, because from chapter 4 on the allegory of the cave into chapter 5 on Heraclitus, because it's Easter Sunday, and I'm outside on this beautiful spring day in April. The disorienting transition takes us from the unchaining of the prisoner, the initial turning, the guiding, hauling up the long passage, and finally the releasement out of the cave into the open region. For Heidegger, it is only at this passing through the threshold and the releasement out of the cave that freedom appears. Quote, certainly removing the chains brings a sort of liberation, but being let loose is not yet real freedom. Real freedom is attained only at stage 3. Here, someone who has been unshackled is at the same time conveyed outside the cave into the open. There, above ground, all things are manifest. The looks that show what things are now no longer appear merely in the man-made and confusing glow of the fire within the cave. The things themselves stand there in the binding force and validity of their own visible form. And the open into which the freed prisoner has now been placed does not mean unboundedness of some wide open space. Rather, the open sets boundaries to things and is the binding power characteristic of the brightness radiating from the sunlight, which we also see. That is a quotation from Heidegger. The releasement of the prisoner out into the open region can be read as the resting of the appearance from concealment. If the story is showing us the essential link between learning and being, then we must be attentive to the manner in which the journey of this prisoner is a tale of learning, as the emergence of the learner from education identified as the process of liberation. In other words, the appearance of freedom from bondage. The various settings, locales of the story itself, specifically the subterranean cave and the open region, represent the two sides of the twofold play. Understood in this way, then, the allegory helps us to understand learning as the unfolding within the dynamic of the twofold play itself. Learning is the dynamic relationship between education, the truth of concealment, and learning, the truth of unconcealment. What we will have to explore further is how the truth of concealment appears when the truth of appearance manifests with freedom. Here we need to explore further the appearance of freedom in this third turning, the releasement of the liberated one out into the open region. The guide has helped the liberated one to make the painful ascent up and out of the cave. Being successfully drawn out into the open region, the former captive is released, and in this releasement is once more disoriented. Upon coming into the open region, his eyes become so full of the sunlight's radiance, quote, that he could not see a single one of the things that he was now told were real. He would need then to grow accustomed before he could see things in the upper world, unquote. Once more, the story depicts the transition as a gradual transformation. The liberated one is first disoriented, overwhelmed by the light, then gradually grows accustomed to the setting. Quote, at first it would be easiest to make out shadows, and then the images of men and things reflected in water, and later on the things themselves, unquote, from the allegory. What is important for our rereading of the story is that the liberated one arrives into the open region prepared to negotiate this strange and new location as a strange and new location. The story underlines that it is he, the learner, who must become accustomed to the new location. He must be readjusted by the open region. The world is prepared to receive him, and in receiving him, transforms him. In his releasement, if it is to be authentic, then he will be capable of receiving this transformation, of undergoing this adjustment, and he will seek not to compel the world to become for him. The world, first and foremost, receives him. In turn, he allows for the things in the open region to be. He is reposed in a dignified calm before the things that appear before him. The gradual transformation is akin to the tuning we discussed above. In being released, he is being held out into this open region and reposed. In being held out, he is made to stand outside of himself to see himself, his reflection for the first time. He experiences the full force of the ecstatic modality, the comportment issued by freedom. To underline the accustomization of the liberated one is to emphasize the binding power of the open region. Thus, freedom retains aspects of bondage, and the truth of concealment appears with the truth of appearance as the binding force of the horizon. The open region is thus identified as a locale, a place of dwelling. The dwelling of freedom is bounded. Freedom manifests as a bounded and binding phenomena. The binding character of freedom is manifold. Freedom is bounded or limited by the truth of appearance, as the shining forth of beings as beings. Without this shining, beings do not appear. But this appearance is always already an appearance from hiding, the arrival of being as shining forth in and with appearance of beings. Freedom, as the essence of learning as discovery, is always already bounded by the arrival of being, and this means it is rooted in the hidden, in the abyss from whence arrives the truth of appearance. As we have said, this is the truth of concealment that is always already the condition of the possibility of possibility for the arrival of being, the arrival that signifies natality itself. Freedom is liberated by this arrival, and thus awaits this arrival and is released by it. The story is thus a tale of the arrival of being in the form of the poetic sage who releases and guides and helps to initiate the transformations, the emergence of the learner. This culminates when the asymmetrical gives way to the symmetric reciprocity between teacher and apprentice, and learning, as a project of being with and alongside, arrives as an ultimate binding force. Thus a fourth kind of binding emerges to define the binding character of freedom, which we may also call the relationality of freedom as attunement. This fourth form is the one that maintains the essential link between beings and is manifest in the fellowship that binds together those who make a philosophy of the people, who wander together, who make the pilgrimage of learning. And that is how I completed the meditation written on this day, the 20th of April, back in 2004, and I read this day, 2014, Easter Sunday, this afternoon here in Summit, 29 Sunset Drive, in the backyard here where the sun is shining, and so appropriately there's a lot of mention of shining, shining forth, the truth of appearance, the truth of unconcealment, the truth of disclosure. What's key here for me is this notion that there is, if the truth of concealment has to do with binding and a binding force, then freedom and the way that we could talk about it as being bound has to do, importantly, with the formation of the learning community that begins in the relationality between the sage and the apprentice, or between teacher and learner. So that there's always this relationality, there's always this ground from which we're appearing, there's always a ground from which beings are appearing. So that's key, because to talk of freedom as appearing from the root or the ground, and the freedom of the human condition appearing from this sort of prior place of dwelling. And where I know I end up going with this relationship is to talk about peace and freedom as being related to one another. And as freedom is always being, in some very important way, rooted in peace, and as freedom arriving from peace. But I'm not quite there yet, although I indicated. Another important thing was that with the quotation from Heidegger, and the way that he talks about the third part of the allegory, it's just a really, really good definition of phenomenology, where he says, and I quote, there above ground all things are manifest. The looks that show what things are now no longer appear in the man-made and confusing glow of the fire. The things themselves stand there in the binding force and validity of their own visible form. The open into which the freed prisoner has now been placed does not mean the unboundedness of some wide open space. Rather, the open sets boundaries to things and is the binding power characteristic of the brightness radiating from the sunlight, which we also see. So the sunlight. What Heidegger is really, there's a couple important moves being made here. One is just the notion of the phenomenology at the root of that term, meaning appearing, right, into brightness, or things appearing. So without the light, we can't perceive. Now, putting aside for a moment the sort of the visual and the sort of visual centric, if you will, or the intensity of perception, the reduction of perception to seeing, putting that aside for now, because that's become more and more problematic for me insofar as in that move of that reduction, you see the exclusion of sound, and I think sound needs to be placed alongside. And I've already mentioned this, that sound's actually, for me, where the reduction is made to, because it's through seeing that the prisoners are in fact able to be quote unquote fooled, and it's through the authenticity of sound, their ability to speak and hear one another, that is sustained all throughout. So there's this interesting relationship between the visual and the auditory. Nevertheless, light, I guess you could say, stands for, and I actually read this in Vasconcelos, where he said that he made the analogy between silence and sound, and light and the appearance of things, right? So, but Heidegger's point is just to give us, I think, a really important sense of what phenomenology is all about. But he's also setting up the vocabulary here of a certain boundary, that there are boundaries. So even though the open is this place in which freedom occurs, it's still bounded. He calls it the binding power characteristic of the brightness. So what he means by that, I think, and what's important, is that the priority is to the things themselves, right? It's so that the perception, or where learning begins, is in the place of, it's a kind of a passive active place where you're receiving something, and it's in the reception that learning begins, right? And this has been consistent throughout what I've been writing, right? So you need to hear something in order to begin to think, the evocative thing. So that's important too. Yeah, I think I'm going to leave it at that. I'm sort of made the points I want to make, read the meditation. It's a transitional one, as I said, and now moving into chapter 5 on Heraclitus. So there's more to be said on that.